You are sitting there again, staring at another headline about children caught in a war they never chose, another family destroyed by a flood, another life erased by a disease that ignored every prayer spoken beside a hospital bed. You close the screen, but the question refuses to leave with it. It follows you into the silence. It waits beside your bed at night. It appears during funerals, in empty churches, in moments when someone tells you that everything happens for a reason. And for just a second, before guilt tells you to stop thinking, another thought slips into your mind. If a world like this exists because it was created intentionally, what does that mean about suffering itself? Most people never say that question out loud, not because it disappears, but because it feels dangerous even to hear yourself think it. So instead, you bury it beneath familiar answers, hoping certainty will eventually become stronger than curiosity. Yet curiosity has a strange habit of surviving. It comes back every time you witness something that feels impossible to reconcile with the idea of perfect goodness. It comes back every time someone says that evil entered the world because human beings made the wrong choice, and you wonder whether that explanation answers every part of the puzzle or simply moves it somewhere else. Before you dismiss this conversation, ask yourself something uncomfortable. Have you ever avoided a question because you were convinced the answer would threaten something you deeply needed to be true? That is not a religious question. That is a human question. Every person does it. We protect ideas that make our lives feel meaningful. We defend beliefs that help us sleep. We avoid possibilities that force us to rebuild the entire structure of our understanding. Imagine a child asking why pain exists. They are not trying to destroy anyone's faith. They are trying to make sense of the world they have just entered. Somewhere along the journey to adulthood, many of us stop asking because we confuse questioning with betrayal. But questioning is often where conviction becomes genuine rather than inherited. Think back to the first time you experienced something that made absolutely no sense. Maybe it was losing someone far too early. Maybe it was watching someone kind suffer while someone cruel seemed to prosper. Maybe it was hearing that everything was part of a perfect plan, while nothing around you felt remotely perfect. Those moments do not automatically erase belief. Sometimes they deepen it. Sometimes they transform it. Sometimes they leave it permanently unsettled. What matters is that they expose something many people quietly experience, but rarely admit. The human mind struggles to hold two powerful ideas together when reality appears to pull them apart. On one side stands the hope that existence has purpose. On the other stands the undeniable presence of suffering. For thousands of years, philosophers, theologians, skeptics, believers, and ordinary people have wrestled with that tension. There has never been a universally accepted answer, only different attempts to understand it. Some conclude that freedom requires the possibility of evil. Others argue that limited human understanding cannot fully grasp divine purposes. Others wonder whether the question itself reveals more about human expectations than about ultimate reality. None of those perspectives erase the emotional force of the problem. They simply show that thoughtful people have approached it from different directions. That is why this conversation matters, not because it promises certainty, but because it reveals how differently people respond to the same mystery. If this question has ever quietly lived in your mind, even if you never admitted it to anyone else, write your perspective below. Not because there is one correct answer waiting to be discovered in the comments, but because honest disagreement often reveals more about the human search for meaning than agreement ever could. What makes this especially unsettling is that many of our strongest emotional reactions come long before our intellectual conclusions. We do not first analyze suffering and then feel disturbed. We feel disturbed, and only afterward do we begin searching for explanations that make the emotion bearable. Psychology has shown repeatedly that human beings are remarkably skilled at constructing narratives that reduce uncertainty. We all do it. Believers do it. Skeptics do it. Everyone does it. The story changes, but the need remains remarkably similar. We want to believe that pain is not meaningless. We want to believe that justice somehow exists beyond what we currently see. We want to believe that the deepest tragedies are not the final chapter. Those desires are profoundly human, regardless of where they ultimately lead. Yet every once in a while, reality interrupts the story. A single event, a single loss, a single question forces us to admit that our answers may not be as complete as we once believed. That realization is not necessarily the end of faith, nor is it necessarily the beginning of disbelief. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of intellectual honesty, and intellectual honesty often starts with the courage to remain inside a difficult question longer than comfort would prefer. The challenge ahead is not to prove anyone right or wrong. It is to examine why this question continues to haunt thoughtful people across generations, cultures, and worldviews, and why the search for an answer tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the mysteries we hope to understand. Before we explore those different ways of thinking, there is another possibility that makes this conversation even more uncomfortable than the question itself. And once you notice it, it becomes very difficult to ignore. There is another reason this question refuses to disappear, and it has less to do with theology than with the way the human mind reacts when two deeply held ideas collide. Imagine someone who has spent their entire life believing that reality is ultimately just and meaningful. Then imagine that same person standing beside the bed of someone they love, watching every hope collapse despite every effort, every prayer, every act of kindness. In that moment, something happens that is difficult to describe. The pain is not only emotional, it is cognitive. Two pictures of reality begin pulling in opposite directions. One picture says that goodness should somehow make sense of suffering. The other says that suffering often arrives without asking who deserves it. That tension is one of the oldest experiences in human history. It is visible in ancient writings, in philosophy, in literature, and in ordinary conversations that happen late at night when people finally admit what they are afraid to say during the day. Notice what usually happens next. Very few people remain comfortable with uncertainty for long. Some conclude that every tragedy must serve a purpose that cannot yet be understood. Others conclude that suffering proves the universe is indifferent. Still others continue believing while accepting that many questions may remain unanswered. None of these responses automatically follows from the facts themselves. They are interpretations, shaped not only by evidence, but also by personality, experience, hope, fear, and the emotional need for coherence. That realization is surprisingly unsettling because it suggests that human beings are rarely detached observers. We are participants. We bring ourselves into every conclusion we reach. Think about two people witnessing the exact same event. One sees evidence that goodness ultimately prevails despite temporary suffering. Another sees evidence that existence is fundamentally chaotic. Neither person is simply observing reality through a perfectly clear window. Each is interpreting reality through a lifetime of memories, losses, expectations, and values. This is why conversations about suffering become so emotionally charged. They are rarely only about logic. They are about identity. They are about the stories that allow us to continue living after our worst experiences. That does not mean evidence and reasoning are unimportant. It means they are often intertwined with something much deeper. We all want a worldview that can survive the hardest days of our lives. The difficult question is whether our worldview shapes how we interpret suffering, or whether suffering reshapes our worldview. Perhaps the answer is different for every person. Imagine a parent losing a child. Imagine someone surviving a natural disaster while everyone around them did not. Imagine a person who spent years trying to live with compassion only to be rewarded with betrayal, illness, and loneliness. These are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They are lived experiences. When people search for answers afterward, they are rarely searching because they enjoy debate. They are searching because they need to know whether pain can coexist with meaning. Throughout history, different traditions have offered different responses. Some emphasize human freedom and its consequences. Some focus on the limits of human understanding. Some suggest that suffering can produce growth, courage, compassion, or transformation that could not exist otherwise. Others argue that these explanations remain emotionally unsatisfying because they do not erase the reality of innocent suffering. Each perspective attempts to grapple with the same mystery from a different angle. None completely removes the tension. Perhaps that is why the question continues to survive generation after generation. If you have ever found yourself pulled between these perspectives, unable to fully settle into any one of them, you are far from alone. Leave a comment describing the moment that most challenged the way you think about suffering. Not so others can declare you right or wrong, but because personal experiences often reveal dimensions of these questions that abstract arguments cannot capture. There is another psychological pattern worth noticing. Human beings naturally search for agency. When something terrible happens, we instinctively ask who caused it, who allowed it, or who could have prevented it. Our brains are remarkably uncomfortable with randomness. Even children ask why long before they understand complex explanations. That instinct has helped human beings survive, but it can also make existential questions feel almost unbearable because they often resist simple answers. What if some of our deepest frustration comes not from the existence of suffering itself, but from our expectation that every event should have an explanation we can fully comprehend? That possibility does not solve the problem. It simply shifts the conversation. It asks whether our demand for complete understanding may itself become another source of pain. Yet there is still one aspect of this discussion that many people avoid, because it reaches beyond arguments and into something intensely personal. It asks whether the greatest struggle is not deciding which explanation is correct, but learning how to live when certainty remains out of reach. That realization changes the emotional landscape entirely. Instead of asking only what suffering means, we begin asking what kind of people we become in response to it. Does pain make us more compassionate or more bitter? Does uncertainty make us more curious or more defensive? Does confronting difficult questions deepen our humility or harden our certainty? These questions may never attract headlines, but they shape lives every single day. And there is one final layer to this exploration that is perhaps the most uncomfortable of all, because it challenges not merely our conclusions about suffering, but our assumptions about why human beings seek certainty in the first place. That is where the conversation is about to become even more personal. The most unsettling possibility is not that you might reach the wrong conclusion about suffering. It is that you might discover you have been asking the wrong question all along. Human beings often believe that peace comes from finally finding an answer that removes every doubt. Yet if you pay attention to the people around you, something unexpected begins to emerge. There are people with immense certainty who remain deeply anxious, and there are people who openly admit they do not have every answer, yet somehow carry remarkable peace. That observation forces another uncomfortable reflection. Perhaps certainty and meaning are not the same thing. Perhaps our obsession with eliminating every mystery sometimes prevents us from learning how to live within one. Think about your own life. The moments that shaped you most were probably not the moments when everything finally made perfect sense. They were the moments when life refused to make sense at all. Losing someone you thought would always be there. Watching a dream collapse after years of sacrifice. Discovering that people you trusted were capable of betraying you. Realizing that being a good person does not guarantee an easy life. None of those experiences arrive with neat explanations attached. They simply happen. Only later do we begin constructing stories that help us carry them. That does not mean those stories are false. It means they are human attempts to create coherence in a reality that often feels fragmented. This is why discussions about suffering are rarely only intellectual. They are deeply personal, because every listener silently substitutes their own memories into the conversation. One person remembers a hospital room, another remembers an empty chair at the dinner table. Someone else remembers years of loneliness, despite doing everything they believed was right. Every philosophy, every worldview, every religious tradition, and every skeptical perspective eventually encounters those moments where abstract ideas meet lived experience. At that point, arguments alone rarely satisfy the heart. What remains is the difficult work of deciding how to respond to a world that contains both astonishing beauty and undeniable pain. One person responds with deeper faith, another with deeper skepticism, another with humility about the limits of human understanding. Another continues searching without feeling ready to settle anywhere. These different responses reveal something important. The existence of disagreement does not automatically prove that one side is irrational or dishonest. It often demonstrates that thoughtful people can interpret the same reality differently because they begin from different experiences, values, and assumptions. That realization deserves more attention than it usually receives. In a culture that rewards quick certainty and confident declarations, there is unusual courage in admitting that some questions resist simple conclusions. That is not intellectual weakness. It can be intellectual integrity. The title of this discussion may have sounded like it promised a decisive answer, but perhaps the deeper value of the conversation lies somewhere else. It lies in recognizing why this question has endured for centuries, despite generations of brilliant minds examining it from every conceivable angle. If there were an effortless solution that satisfied everyone, history would probably look very different. Instead, what we find is an ongoing dialogue that stretches across philosophy, psychology, theology, literature, and ordinary human experience. That alone should inspire humility. It reminds us that profound questions often deserve careful reflection rather than immediate certainty. If this conversation challenged the way you think, not by telling you what to believe, but by encouraging you to examine why you believe what you believe, then it has already accomplished something meaningful. And if you disagree with the perspectives explored here, explain why in the comments. Not to defeat someone else, but because genuine discussion becomes most valuable when people are willing to explain their reasoning, instead of simply repeating conclusions. The quality of a conversation is often measured not by how quickly people agree, but by how honestly they engage with disagreement. Before leaving, consider one final thought. Human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We ask questions because we long for understanding, but we also ask questions because we long for reassurance. Sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes they are not. It is entirely possible to discover that the deepest transformation does not occur when every mystery disappears. It may occur when we become the kind of people who can face mystery without surrendering our compassion, curiosity, or humility. Whether you approach life through faith, doubt, philosophy, or a combination of all three, suffering remains one of the greatest realities every worldview must confront. No single video can resolve it. No single argument can erase it. But perhaps honest reflection can make us less afraid of difficult questions and more willing to listen to those who have reached different conclusions through equally sincere searching. In the end, the question is not merely whether suffering fits neatly into any particular explanation. The question is what our response to suffering says about us. Does it make us more willing to understand people whose journeys differ from our own? Does it encourage empathy instead of certainty, reflection instead of contempt, humility instead of arrogance? Those may not be the easiest questions, but they are among the most important. And perhaps the search for those answers reveals as much about the human condition as any conclusion we hope to reach about the mysteries that continue to challenge us all.